I've built the ultimate gaming PC and I'm not going to play games with it. I'm going to use it for YouTube. And that is exactly the topic of today's video. What specs does your computer need to have, your new computer need to have if you want to use it for YouTube? Hi, my name is Dexter Clark and I've been on YouTube since 2010. And in September 2020 I started this YouTube channel to help YouTube creators to get a quick start on YouTube. Writing scripts. For writing scripts you don't need a really fancy computer. You can do with your old computer, with a tablet, with your laptop, desktop, doesn't matter that much. You can even use your phone if you want to outline the video or something. And of course you need some kind of text editor like Google Docs or Word or OpenOffice or something. Then, if you want to edit your thumbnails, you use a photo editor like a PaintShop Pro or Affinity Photo or Photoshop or Canva or something. If you want to do simple stuff, you don't need much. You can do with your old computer. But if you want to do some more advanced stuff, and with advanced stuff I mean live layers, then your computer needs to be a bit more powerful. A live layer is, for example, an effect that you apply to your thumbnail that is live calculated instead of calculated once. Those live layers are non-destructive, so you can undo it if you want and even adjust them after you applied the effect. If you want to go that route, I would say pick a more advanced computer, for example a i5 or i7 processor in your computer with 4 cores or so. 8 or 16 gigabytes will suffice for that purpose. I will put a link to an article on my website in the video description with all the specifications that I mentioned in this video. Then video editing, and this is where things get hot, quite literally. For video editing you need a fast CPU processor and you need a fast GPU, your graphics card. A GPU is often confused with a graphics card. A graphics card you stick in your computer and on your graphics card is a GPU. But how much and where that accent lies on what component it uses depends heavily on the software. For example, DaVinci Resolve leans heavily on the GPU and, for example, Adobe Premiere leans heavily on the CPU. For video editing I would recommend NVIDIA graphics cards because there's better support from editing software for NVIDIA graphics cards. NVIDIA graphics cards use something called CUDA, and the more CUDA cores you have on your GPU, the faster your rendering will be. NVIDIA has also an encoder called NVENC or NVIDIA encoder. That encoder takes care on the GPU of the encoding of H.264 and H.265. H.264 is the recommended video format for YouTube, by the way. And it does so without having to bother the processor, but your video editing software has to support that. What specs you exactly need depends heavily on what video resolution that you're going to edit. For example, HD video takes up less system resources than 4K or 8K footage, for example. For 4K footage at least I would recommend an SSD over a traditional hard disk, because an SSD is much quicker and the hard disk can have trouble reading and writing your video files from and to the hard disk quick enough. My preferred configuration would be an SSD and a hard disk, because a hard disk is more reliable when it comes to storage. Then you can install your programs and your Windows and your video files on your C drive, on your SSD, so that's quick, and on your D drive, that's your traditional hard disk, you put all your data that you want to keep. When it comes to software, I would stay away from Final Cut Pro 10. I worked with Final Cut Pro 7, that was back then hands down the best editing software there was on the market, but its successor Final Cut Pro 10 has a super illogic workflow, and it does things and it moves things for you that you never want to do. It forces an illogic workflow, it has extreme amount of bugs. Apple refuses to fix bugs. It is hands down the worst editing software ever on the market. I'm currently looking into DaVinci Resolve, which is finally a mature video editing software package. It has a free version. That free version is pretty complete. I have to say I tried it out on my Macs and it was super buggy and it crashes all the time. But now I have some hardware that really supports DaVinci Resolve and it works amazing. Also, Adobe Premiere is used a lot by YouTubers. I've used over the years Adobe Premiere 5 and 6, those were the previous versions. Adobe Premiere is good, but it's not amazing by any stretch of the imagination. The only thing why I don't use Premiere is simply because of the ridiculous licensing fees. If you're just starting out, I would say try and look into Windows Movie Maker or Apple's iMovie. Those are free, those are pretty easy to understand, but they have limited functionality. The minimum recommendations for a computer for video editing are an i7 processor with at least 8 cores, preferably an i9 with 10 cores or more. Both of those processors of the latest generation, because those are the quickest. Then I would say 32 gigabytes of RAM or even 64, especially when you want to edit 4K footage, an SSD, an Nvidia GPU with at least 8 gigabytes of RAM, 11 preferably or more when you want to edit 4K. Oh, and don't forget the power supply. It needs to have at least 600 watts, but if you want to use a higher end graphics card, then you absolutely need at least 750 watts. And yes, this is going to be an expensive machine. Then the fourth use case is streaming, and when you want to stream, it depends a little bit on what you're going to stream, how beefy of a computer you need to have. Because your computer might get a little bit overwhelmed with it, also has to do streaming on top of the things it already does. Here is where the Nvidia NVENC encoder comes in, because it can take over a little bit of that heavy workload of the CPU. If you want to stream heavy 3D games, then you need to have a heavy CPU and a heavy GPU and a heavy power supply to support the two. But if you're only streaming talking head videos, yeah, you can do with a lot less. Super optional but super handy to have is the Elgato Stream Deck. This is a physical device with physical buttons that you can press to switch scenes. You can do that also in your streaming software, but when you play a game, it's easier to press on the button instead of having to dive into your streaming software every single time. If you start with streaming, I heavily suggest you check out OBS. OBS, it's free and it has all the functionalities you might need for a streaming software. And then if you advance later, then you can check out some commercial alternatives. The recommended specs for streaming, I would say check out first the specs that your game needs, and on top of that you need a little bit extra. I would say an i7 processor with at least 8 cores, an i9 preferably with 10 cores or more, then an Nvidia graphics card, pretty heavy duty if you want to play some heavy 3D games, 16 or 32 gigabytes of RAM and a heavy power supply, 600 watts or even more. A computer is just part of your equipment, but what else do you need? More importantly, what do you really need for YouTube? I'll talk about that in this video. I'll talk about cameras, lights, microphones. If you like this video, you should definitely check out this playlist right here with all my recommended videos on this channel.